Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I'm making a video response to Thomas, also known as Debate with M, and Thomas has made a video response to my video entitled Dawn of the Dead, New Testament style, where I talked about certain verses in the Gospel of Matthew, and I will post a link for that video in the description section. Now, what's interesting, Thomas, is that I seriously thought that you were going to try and say that I was wrong about what I was talking about in the Gospel of Matthew, and I found it interesting that you actually thanked me for the video, and then you went about and you talked about the Quran. Now, you'll notice the title of this video is called Apples and Oranges, and the reason why I say apples and oranges is because when you're analyzing the Bible or the Quran, you have to treat them as two separate books, obviously. I mean, they both claim to be the Word of God. We have to look at them from different perspectives. You have to see what they claim about themselves, what people claim for the Quran, what biblical scholars say about the Bible, what Muslim scholars say about the Quran, and the nature of both books. Now, I say that because the thing is that the things that are in the Bible, now you make an interesting point. I want to go on about this. You say that, okay, so you have four authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they're apparently being inspired by the same perfect source to write the same event, but yet they have differences, okay? That's the basic premise here. With the Quran, however, you have, basically what you have is you have one perfect source inspiring one source, meaning you have God and then you have Muhammad. Now, both books are of a different nature. Now, interesting enough, the term progressive revelation comes to my mind. Now, the Bible, with regards to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, don't claim to be progressive revelation. Mark says in his gospel, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, and Luke explains that he thought it would be good of him to write down an account of all the things that have transpired, since he's the most educated in things of this nature. Now, having said that, the Quran does not claim to be just a one-time sit-down, write out the whole thing type of book. The Quran claims to be a progressive revelation, meaning that there is an account that is given, but then later on the account is brought up again with more expanded upon information, more of an emphasis on a certain passage and things of this nature. And interesting enough, the Muslim scholars have sciences for this. They actually have terminology for explaining when and why the Quran does this. And I'm going to post an article, two articles. One is just the link about the topic of contradictions in the Quran and how they're refuted, and then I'm going to post specifically this article that talks about the subject of essentially when the Quran expands upon itself. Now, there are long Arabic phrases, and I don't want to butcher the pronunciation, but if I could paraphrase the whole article, essentially what Muslim scholars say is they say that when you have to look at each topic in the Quran. So when the Quran talks about the afterlife, like heaven, you have to look at all of the verses about heaven. When it talks about hell, you have to look at all the verses about hell, etc., etc., etc. To do this, because then you get the full picture. Because scholars of the Quran agree that God revealed multiple pieces of information, because the Quran is a progressive revelation. So, for example, let's go with one of the verses you brought up as an example. You say chapter 15, verse 28 contradicts chapter 38, verse 71. Now, 15, verse 28 says the following, and I believe, Thomas, you're using the Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but I'm using a more literal translation of the Quran. This has a very much more literal, and it's translated by Abdul Rahman Omar and Abdul Manan Omar. And both these gentlemen studied the works of previous Quranic translators and scholars. And so this, in my opinion, would be a better translation, a more literal translation at that. And this is the following for verse 15, verse 28. It reads the following. It says, and recall the time when your Lord said to the angels, I am indeed going to create a human being from dry, wringing clay, formed from black mud, molded into shape. And then of course verse 38:71 just says that man is created from clay. Well, again, if we look at the science of analyzing the Quran, the article reads that you have to analyze the Quran. The Quran is like a half sphere of itself, meaning that there might be one verse which is mentioned very quickly, one scenario that's mentioned very quickly, and then in another verse more explanation is given. This is the case of this verse. So for an example, when in verse 28 it says that man is formed from clay. But in verse 28 of chapter 15, God says, where does he get the clay from? And it says that he got the clay from mud from the earth. And indeed, there is a hadith that even expands upon this even further, where it says that God sent an angel down to collect the mud, brought it back up to God. God then formed, out of the mud, he formed clay, and from the clay, he formed man. So really, there is no contradiction here. It is just an emphasis, an explanation on the entire happenings. Now, you mention in chapter 2, verse 35, and chapter 7, verse 19, you mentioned that there's a difference in wording, that God says, eat of the bountiful food, and I believe the other word is the gracious food. Again, this has to depend on what word, on which word you translate from. In fact, in some translations, this one here mentions in parentheses each of the words that could be used in translation, such as gracious, bountiful, things like this. It's not a contradiction, it's God explaining the food in which Adam and Eve could eat from. You mentioned the two verses about Noah, chapter 7, verse 59 and 11:25. First off, with Noah here, there is no historical background given. God mentions when Noah preaches to his people, and it mentions two different things that Noah says. Now, granted, they're very similar, and you're right, Thomas, but how are we to know whether how are we to know if this is the same exact time in which Noah was preaching to his people? That God is quoting Noah in both these cases are the same event. How do we know that? Because if you look at the context, in all honesty, it's voided of any sort of historical background, meaning that we don't know when Noah said this or when Noah said that. He preached to his people for many years, so it's very likely that he had more than one discourse with his people. He probably talked to his people and said a variety of things. And plus, this is not God talking. This is Noah talking. So this is Noah saying to his people two different things. This is not God contradicting himself. This is Noah. This is God quoting Noah in two different instances. 27 verse 9 through 10, chapter 28, 30 through 31 talks about Moses and how God described himself. And again, it's just a different phrase. Again, the scholars of Islam and the scholars of the Quran would say that God most likely said both phrases to Moses. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation, look at I forget if it's either the one in chapter 27 or the one in chapter 28. But what's interesting, when he says that I am the Lord eternal or something to that effect, in the English rendering it says it's dot, right? Meaning that God actually said more, but that's all God quotes at that particular verse. So God might have said both things. But again, you have to look at the science of the Quran. You have to look at how the Quran was revealed. Again, it was a progressive revelation. God gave more details about the same story because it is a progressive revelation. These things weren't just handed down. Now, you mention again, another good example of apples and oranges, Thomas. You say that you don't understand chapter 27, verse 82 about this beast that's going to come and confront unbelievers. You say that it's very similar to the Dawn of the Dead story in the Gospel of Matthew. I would have to disagree with you. They're very different. The one about the beast happens on the Day of Judgment. Which hasn't even happened yet. God is talking about an event that has not yet happened but will happen. In Matthew, the Dawn of the Dead scenario happened already. It's a past document. It's a document describing an event that happened already, and I brought up the point that Matthew's the only one out of all the people that were writing about history or happenings in Jerusalem during the first century, Matthew's the only one who wrote about it. So again, I will post the articles for what I've been talking about, where I'm getting this whole science of Quran and things of this nature. And again, since you use Abdul Yusuf Ali, Thomas, Abdul Yusuf Ali, if you look at his commentary, he says the same thing that this article is going to say about the progressive revelation and things of this nature. Anyway, thank you everyone for watching. Peace be with you.